So good afternoon and good morning and good evening to everyone, wherever you are. We're very pleased to have today with us Professor Mark Anner from Penn State, which is also a partner of the Global Labor University, and very happy to have so many of you familiar faces in this meeting. I know that everybody is busy, but yet you find the opportunity to join our meeting. So without losing much time, we're going straight to the first question, and I'll invite Mark to give some initial thoughts to that first question. Then we open up for discussion, and then we go to the second question with the same process. So I would kindly ask you to keep your microphones off if you're not speaking, and then after Mark's initial feedback, you can just put your question either in the chat section or raise your hand. So Mark, thanks again for the very interesting video lecture, and which has really come up in the different video lectures and in different discussions we have had, the issue of global binding agreements. So the first question is that it seems that one of the most important elements of such agreements, such as the Accord, for instance, is the use of binding arbitration. In your video lecture, you mentioned that this mechanism was used twice, resulting in some major settlements. And these were cases that went up to the courts in The Hague. This seems to suggest that cases which make it to the binding arbitration are usually the most serious ones, where the violations are more blatant and involve a large number of factories and workers. Are there other elements of the global binding agreements that can complement this binding arbitration at international courts for other cases of violations? And if you could provide any examples on this.
Great, thank you. It's really lovely to be here. I'm seeing some familiar faces, which is also nice. Hi, Angelique, Ramon, others. Good to see you, and good to see some new faces too. Yeah, this is a really great question. And I'll just preface it by saying I'm obviously, I'm gonna turn off my email so it stops beeping. Preface this by saying, this is in contrast to these voluntary initiatives. So this is a whole nother way of approaching the issue of worker rights in in supply chains. And at the same time, as I mentioned, I see this building on the global framework agreements. This is sort of taking maybe the next generation of global framework agreements. So what do they add in addition to the binding element? I picked the word binding to emphasize that. So first, these steps are all very important. They're negotiated, right? So unlike voluntary CSR, a company says, here's our CSR program. These agreements come about because labor unions, global union federations, and their members negotiate with multinational firms. And the other aspect where they differ from framework agreements is they're multi-actor, meaning a group of multinationals and a group of labor unions and sometimes allies, Worker Rights Consortium, Clean Clothes Campaign. So they're negotiated. And once you negotiate them, the next step is really oversight and implementation, which you can call co-governance. So there is a committee that meets on a regular basis to make sure this is going as planned. And then you have these other clauses, and let me add another very important one in this, really a crucial one, is what I call cost sharing. So if there are issues to be addressed, so in this case, building safety, there's a cost to the building safety. Then the question is, who pays that cost? Now, under the CSR model, these things are really dictated by the brands telling the suppliers, you need to have this, this, and this, and this. And then it's on you, in effect, and we're going to inspect you. And then you get the bill for the inspections. So when the CSR auditor or social auditors come by, you pay everything, right? So with good reason, the suppliers complained about this. So that clause in the accord is really crucial. It said the buyer, when it says, make this shirt for me for $2.50, they have to have an understanding of how that $2.50 is going to cover wages, benefits, and the cost. Most specifically in the case of the court, the cost of safe buildings, okay? So this is a whole different world. All these elements interact. That part, your obligation as the brand, right, whether you're H&M, whoever you are, to cover the cost, make sure it's covered. In other words, maybe I paid such a good price I feel confident my price point is sufficient for building safety. But the real thing is maybe I didn't. Maybe I'm squeezing on price, and there is no possible way a reasonable person can conclude that price point is sufficient to cover the cost of building safety. That's where you don't go straight to arbitration. That's where you can have a complaint mechanism, and that complaint mechanism escalates. It goes to that co-governance body. There's a warning. There's a second warning. There's a vote in the committee, and eventually, if it's still not resolved after repeated warnings and processes, any party can recommend binding arbitration, right? So now, is it the severity? Is it so? It's basically that principle, and it's based on it's by the buyer, X company, in its supply chain in Bangladesh. Maybe 10 factories are fine, but 20 are not. Doesn't matter. If there is a proven case that they didn't cover the cost of building safety, and they don't respond to all these many steps of escalation, then it can go to the court, and the court reviews the case and decides whether there's a foundation to move forward. In both cases, The Hague agreed there was a sufficient foundation to move forward. And they did. And of course, then what happens as it goes forward, the buyers, two different companies, saw the writing on the wall, and they settled for millions of dollars. Now, the last thing I'll say on this point is when that happened, folks in the Accord that monitor very carefully the question of compliance for all the companies, keep in mind at this point of the Accord, there's over 200 multinational corporations, compliance rates for everybody went up, right? So sometimes there's this thing, oh, you only had 2 cases. It sent a signal. We're not fooling around here. This is not just something on paper, binding something. This is serious. We went after 2 and we basically won. It cost them millions of dollars. Do you want to be next? So everybody watched those 2 cases, and compliance went up across the board after those cases were resolved the way they were.
Well, thanks for that, Mark. Very important to start our conversation. And so the floor is open. Who'd like to either take the floor, like really speak, or put the question on the chat? But I mean, it's a manageable group. Please feel free to take the floor. Okay, Benji, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Edlira. Hi, Mark. So my question is, I mean, it's really good to hear about that global binding agreements have been forged, like in Bangladesh, like in Lesotho. Although I think one important point is that there's just very few of them. So what do you think? How is it possible for such binding agreements to be replicated elsewhere in more countries, in more settings? Because initially it seems like there's like certain I don't know if that's an appropriate analogy. There's just Goldilocks conditions. It seems it doesn't seem easily replicable in other places. What do you think?
No, that's an excellent point. So you have the ones you mentioned. There's 2 campaigns for new ones around wages and severance pay in the garment sector. There's a case, and this is a research project I'm working on now in Honduras, where they call it the Washington Agreement, but it basically fits this model of a global binding agreement. So I'll just say, I spent a lot of time thinking of the term, and who knows, maybe there's no, in Spanish we say echo, it doesn't go anywhere, and we don't stick with this term global binding agreements. But I spent a lot of time thinking about it. It's related to, others are talking about worker-driven social responsibility. And that's, it's the same approach. My reason for going with global binding agreements is because, as I said, I see them building on global framework agreements. So, I'm in touch with a lot of the global union federations. I was just on this event yesterday with them, and they're listening to this idea. There are over 300 global framework agreements. So on the call yesterday, Uni Global said that we have 50 of them, right? So what I'm sort of saying is to the union movement, this, like, if you really want to expand something, how do you do it? You build on pre-existing structures. You don't start from zero. So partly what I'm saying, maybe we just call this the next generation of global framework agreements. I think I touched on it, that from the research I've seen, about 10% of those global framework agreements have some sort of arbitration system, some form of initial binding. 90% don't. So partly I'm saying, hey, all of you, you global union federations, as you go forward and renegotiate or negotiate new global framework agreements, maybe the time has come that we move beyond just having a framework and we take it to the next level, which is something that has real teeth in it and some binding processes. And the second thing, of course, I'm also saying too, is maybe when possible, cluster these and have them multi-actor agreements. So you build on those 300 plus framework agreements that exist in every industry. Global unions do this all the time. And you say times have evolved, we've got to take this to the next level. And that's the way you could get there, I think, more efficiently. So you have to have the buy-in from the key actors on the union side.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks, Benji, for the question. Somebody else would like to make a question? Tia, are you turning on the microphone? Yes, please go ahead.
Yes. Thank you. Hello, Mark.
Hi.
I was wondering if this global binding agreement is something what we call like the OECD. Is it part of it? And what I've read is the international framework agreements are a non-binding agreement. And my question is, which one is stronger, the human rights due diligence law and this OECD? Is in some of the OECD countries, or is it how do they complement each other? Is it possible if a trade union can complain to both institutions parallelly, and how does it work?
Sure.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, great question. Yeah, so they're different. So the OECD process, there's a lot of different mechanisms, the guidelines on multinational enterprises was started as sort of the Ruggie principles and became the UN guiding principles, which became the foundation for due diligence, which is now becoming the foundation for mandatory due diligence. That process, and if I have a chance, I might put up a couple slides because I was working on this yesterday in this presentation. That process is more state-led, right? So the global framework agreements evolving perhaps into global binding agreements are led by trade unions, global unions, federations, and multinationals. So they're, if you will, bipartite agreements, labor and employers. The whole mandatory due diligence process is state-led. So the French government comes up with this law on the duty of vigilance for French companies, or now we're starting to see in the European Union, any company with significant operations in the European Union would have to follow that. So if, I don't know, General Motors or Amazon or something has a big presence in the European Union, which it does, would have to follow it. So that you have the French government, the Dutch government, the Norwegian government, the German government most recently, and now at the EU level, which is going to be one of the stronger ones. The language is really evolving. Those initiatives really started when you go back 10 years or more. There was three major limitations to those initial ones. One, the issues they covered was child labor and forced labor. Okay, child labor and forced labor is very important. Nothing about freedom of association, the right to bargain collectively. That was one. Two, they weren't binding. And three, the scale was very narrow. It was only the biggest of the big corporations. If you have sales over so many billions, you have to follow this. So where it's heading now is, it's like at the European level, it's a much lower threshold. So far more companies have to do this. It's not limited to child labor and forced labor. That's included, but includes the whole range of decent work. So obviously discrimination and but also freedom of association and collective bargaining. And lastly, it's binding. There are consequences for not doing this. I see these as complementing each other. And I could maybe put up a figure later how I see these things fitting together. But that's the difference. That's state-led due diligence, telling a multinational, look all the way down your supply chain and make sure decent work is being respected. This is no longer in a world where you can, in theory, say, oh, I outsource that fair and square. If there's problems, that employer has to deal with it. I just buy something from that employer. No, that's your supply chain making your product, which you make a profit on. You have to ensure decent work is taking place at every component of the supply chain. Thanks for the question. Great question.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you both. Yes, Tinik Bangpai, please take the floor.
Yeah, thank you so much. I actually don't know if my question will be applicable here, but I want to ask, do these agreements apply also to service organizations? Because we have in Nigeria, here in Nigeria, we see companies outsource some of their functions. And in some cases, these provider firms send workers to the client firms to perform such functions. But the case is always a case of those workers not enjoying the work conditions as that of the core workers in the client firms. And the supplier firms do not also make such provisions either. So what do you have to say on that?
Yeah, great question. And the short answer is yes, absolutely. It applies to the service sector. So in fact, like I said, I was in this discussion yesterday with Uni Global, and they're dealing with services. So if you think, services, whatever it could be, you're not making something, you're providing a service. I mean, it could be anything from types of healthcare call centers or what have you, but anywhere where there's an employment relationship where somebody gets up and goes to work or works from home and gets paid for that, there is the possibility of abuse, and workers should have the right to work with dignity, to decent work. And if somebody is contracting that services and making a profit off of that, they have an obligation. So we have, in fact, so we have an obligation to ensure both in manufacturing, farming, mining, and services that everyone has decent work throughout the supply chain. That's where this is heading. And it can be also done through global binding agreements, right? You can have agreements with the service company, and they have to ensure that suppliers, where their workers, have decent work. I spent a lot of time thinking about this particular question, and the more I think about global supply chains, the truth is every single supply chain brings in all sectors, right? So I study mostly garments. I mean, I also look a bit at food, electronics. Years ago, I studied auto. So you take garments. Okay, well, where does it start? Well, it starts in cotton. So it starts in agriculture, it's not manufacturing. And also you have a zipper on your jeans, that's mining. So you have mining and agriculture going into that product. That product, which we'll look at tomorrow, eventually in 99% of the cases gets put on a ship, and it's in, now you're into transportation. Where does that go from there? It ends up in a port, which goes to a distribution center, which is providing a service. It gets put on a truck, which is transportation. It goes to a retail store, which is services. And you have a complaint, the product didn't fit right, you get on the call and you call customer service, you're dealing with services. So every supply chain to different degrees brings in all these different aspects of the global economy. You could add others. I mean, when this is being made, somebody doing the trim on it might be sitting at home on the floor in a village in India or Pakistan or somewhere doing homework. I mean, that's all part of these supply chains, and every single person and every aspect of that, anyone who touches in any way the product deserves decent work. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
Thanks, Mark. Somebody else would like to make a question or a comment related to what we're discussing?
Maybe I do.
Yes, Alejandra.
Hi. I was thinking when you were talking about this that it's very difficult for me to figure out how to make an agreement that fits for transportation workers, like garment workers and services workers, all for the same. It's just I don't know how to which demands we could include in these global binding agreements. I don't know if I'm clear enough.
Sure. Yeah, great question. I mean, it's this, what I'm, these are, I think it's hard to have like it's going to be segmented in a sense, right? It's hard to have a binding agreement that's going to cover everything from cotton to, the retail store where it's sold. I'm just saying these supply chains are so interconnected. So you end up with like the Accord, or you end up with like the Lesotho Agreement, or you end up with, something in mining. I mean, some of the earlier ones, even Dodd-Frank was, Democratic Republic of Congo was looking at child labor in mining and stuff. So they're going to be sector specific. My point is those sectors are interconnected. So global union federations are going to focus on the sectors they focus on. Now, it is interesting. You look at the Bangladesh Accord, who are the signatories for labor? It's Industrial, which makes sense. Industrial, right? You had the merger, it brought in textiles. It used to be a separate. Industrial represents garment workers. Okay, they're in it. Who else is in it? Uni Global. Why? Because you're talking about a product that gets sold through retail. So you actually do have, in that case, a global binding agreement with a global union federation from manufacturing, a global union federation from services, coming together, right? It's really quite an interesting example. I hope that helps. That was a great question. Thank you. They're all good questions.
And Mark, just continuing on that, so were there discussions to have the ITF also included, transporting the goods? So was that even in question?
It not that I know of, no, but it makes complete sense, right? I mean, this is part of the point, and then it's such that's the bottleneck, as we know now with what's going on with shipping and everything else. That's the sort of the open veins of the global economy. That's everything goes through that, and any bottlenecks there. It's everything from computers and smartphones to T-shirts to cars, right? We don't, US, I don't know, there's total crisis in both new and old cars because they can't get these chips. And then everyone tried to buy an old car, and then all the car lots are empty. These are all these bottlenecks, container cost, tripling in cost or more. So no, absolutely, they're absolutely linked. Part of it, we're in this interconnected world, and there's this a really complex form of a race to the bottom. It's not just about wages. I mean, I argued in one paper, part of where production was going was where labor was most controlled, sort of the old labor process. There was about control over labor. So, China and countries had much higher labor costs, but production was flowing in, and there was a sense that there was this sense of labor control. So there's all these different factors going on as countries compete to get segments of these supply chains, how they're pushing to keep workers' rights down. And now we're trying to come up with mechanisms to pull worker rights up. And it's this gets to the core of the problem. It's just an illustrative example of Bangladesh. Really, the Bangladeshi government and the employers are saying, we're in a hyper competitive world. what we're seeing we need to do is we actually have to keep labor down and under control. We're not going to make it easy to form unions and bargain. We're going to call the police to put down strikes. And then someone from the Accord comes in and says, oh, buildings are unsafe, Rana Plaza, other cases, you've got to cover the cost of safe buildings. And their response is, it's interesting, they almost see that as a form of imperialism, and they get really, ticked off about, here you go again, you come in from the West, putting more demands on us, but no one ever gives us the money to actually cover the cost of decent work, right? And there's a point there, right? So we get this tension. They're getting a message, keep costs down and control labor in order to compete. And then outside forces come in and say, you got to do this, this, and this, and this to have decent work. So the Accord was interesting. It's not just that binding, is that cost sharing clause that I refer to it. It says in it, the buyer shall ensure that the price point they provide for their product or other purchasing practices helps to cover the cost of safe building. That's the direction. And that's how you could start the conversation when you finally get local actors to say, okay, this might be a mechanism that works for me. They're still very doubtful that the companies are going to deliver and fully pay up. But that's the tension, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Ramon?
Hi, Mark.
Good to see you.
Yeah, let's see. I prefer not to comment as an industrial practitioner. I prefer to comment as an academe. Looking at the global binding agreement, it is a as an Anastal assertion that it is a form of a new global governance regime, wherein we are looking at what particular alternative to those plethora of voluntary initiatives like codes of conduct, global compact, and the rest that are not really binding, and looking at the prospects of global framework agreement. So, of course, industrial are promoting or negotiating for more GFAs to cover as much as possible all the sectoral that are in the Global Union Federation. But of course, we are looking at assessing based on different theories, particularly on the rational institutionalism, sociological institutionalism theory that looks on the way organizations are managed to geared up to those new forms of global governance regime. And global framework agreements also has an effective mechanism that binds multinational. But I'm trying to look on some of the problematic areas wherein first the enforcement mechanism of this GFA, wherein how we can address the deviation of the agreement between the two. I'm looking at the proper institutional mechanism. I also trying to come up or differentiate it with the existing WTO regime, wherein there's a debate between the global north and the global south between whether the WTO will be an effective regime of enforcing labor standard at a global level. So I'm looking at the GFA, wherein when there is a deviation or non-compliant of those agreed agreement at the global level, whose organization, whose institution that will provide some, I don't know if there's a sanction or whatever enforcement mechanisms. So that's my first point. My second point will be as also looking at the experience, wherein the effectiveness of global framework agreement will be in a knot if there's no coordination among trade unions at the different levels. It would not really matter because I know because looking at the study about effectiveness of this GFA from the global, regional, and the national, if there's no level of coordination among those trade unions, it will not really make pressure on the multinationals that negotiated toward this agreement. And my third and last point will be the frequency of coordination among different actors. I mean, well, the GFA just held their meetings once or twice a year. So there's not much information that has been cascaded to all the workers in the entire supply chain. It could really come up with a mechanism to coordinate among the unions, then I think that could be a powerful tool that we can use to pressure the multinationals to adhere to the negotiated agreement in the GFA. Thank you. Thank you very much for that.
Well, thank you. Really insightful reflections. The question about what mechanism is really a crucial question. So when we talk about those two cases, just to share with you, I mean, this is public information. When those two cases went forward, the global unions reached out to me and asked me to be the one labor expert on the cases. So I was deeply involved with those cases. The point I could share, and the unions, very much agree with, is the process at The Hague is a huge, costly, timely process. It's clunky. It goes slowly. What did they do when they were negotiating this, right? They said, okay, it has to have binding. Well, how do we do binding? Well, they turned to legal mechanisms that international parties use in commercial disputes. So forget about labor, forget about all of us. Company X says, I'm going to buy, $1 million in product from company Y. Company Y doesn't deliver. And this is in the global economy. What do? So you go to these international tribunals that deal with commercial disputes, and there's millions and millions of dollars at stake. And you present these cases. When we were to do this, I mean, we went through disclosure. I was given thousands and thousands of pages of documents. We were getting ready to go to The Hague. They told me, prepare for definitely 1 week of hearings, but probably 2. So I was to block out 2 weeks. So imagine all this. So we're going through these cases now, and there was a law firm for the labor side, and they had a team that were really working around the clock to prepare all of this. So the question, imagine having to do that for every single global binding agreement, every single case. It would be impossible. So the unions themselves concluded that, what we did work, the outcome was good. It was the first go at having a binding process. But they were incredibly clear, saying going forward, we need to find an alternative that's quicker and more efficient. So I'll share a little personally about myself. So I became exposed to worker labor issues through partly a lot of different things. My dad is an arbitrator in the U.S. system. So you think of it this way: you've got labor courts that take forever in a day. I've been many times in Latin America, lived many years there. These cases would go, someone gets fired and they tried to form a union and they get fired, and the boss says, oh, they were low productivity. And the worker said, no, I tried to form a union. They could be 3 years later still trying to get their case heard. So everywhere in the world, labor courts take a long time. So you have, US in many places, an alternative system of arbitration. So my dad, in this case, an arbitrator, sits like a little judge. It's 1 day. You got 1 day to present your case. And you come in, boom, boom, boom. He then goes home for 1day. I've seen him do, he goes through all the evidence and he writes up his decision. And boom, and you move on, next case. And that repeatedly, people have complained. We didn't like he was too harsh, he was too soft, he did this and that. They try to take it to courts. They always back up the arbitrator. It has to be a really, it's very, very rare that decision gets overturned. And these cases go through again and again and again. They move through with tremendous efficiency. So I see the folks, and if you read the new language, we now have this recently signed international accord, right? It was just a lot of work to get there. It's interesting, I think I mentioned this in the talk. Now they're still very aware of the cumbersomeness of the present system, how long it takes, how costly it can be. But they don't yet have an answer when they're signing this. This is very recently. So it says in that international accord, we will continue to use the existing system. However, we will work on establishing a more efficient system, and at such time that that efficient system is in place, we will transition over to the new system, right? So there's a lot of really smart people, lawyers, I'm not a lawyer, working on this and trying to figure out, and I hope it can move to that kind of one-off arbitration type system. One of the reasons they were able to do this in those two cases was the law firm did it pro bono. They said it would have been, they would have won millions of dollars. They would have spent millions of dollars of lawyers on the, these cases. So it's such a crucial point. We need to, as we go forward with these and do more of them, we need a much more efficient system. The coordination among the unions, I agree, is absolutely crucial. You have the mechanism there, right? And I think last I heard, isn't the transportation workers sort of, you have the global unions and there are some meetings and discussions there, but that I agree could become more efficient. The other point I want to emphasize is this. As we move forward with these types of global binding agreements, these even mandatory due diligence, we have to be very careful that we don't move faster from the top than developments are on the ground. There has to be ownership for the workers and the folks in the countries that are involved with these issues. And many years ago, I was living in Central America, so I was very close to development on the ground then. There was an agreement, we no need to go into the details, but it was in the banana sector. And there was one country that was very involved in contact with the global union in Europe and getting this negotiated. And there was, those elections, they were the ones that were selected to do this. And the agreement goes through. My point is, years later, when they studied how that agreement affected banana workers, the one country where there was an elected folks to be involved in the negotiation, that was the one country that was using the global framework agreement the most efficiently. And just to put it like this, just so we're just talking really how this stuff works and what are things to look for. The other countries, as if the agreement finally gets negotiated and somebody sends them an email attachment saying, oh, we have this agreement. So my point is, there was no ownership on the base level by the workers of what is this agreement? What do we do with it? How do we use it? There was no ownership over it. Only the one country that did have the direct involvement had the ownership. So we have to this is another part of these processes. We're dealing with this complex global economy. We need to put pressure on these multinationals from the top down to get them in, but we constantly have to keep the workers involved. And remember, they're the fundamental building block of this process. If they're not involved, if they're not participating, if they're not aware of this, they don't know how to use it and see how to their own benefits, they'll just sit, on somebody's desk somewhere or somebody's inbox.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much, Mark. I think there was a question in the chat box from Gift that you responded. Gift, I feel like that, but let me know what you think. And meanwhile, Gifford, yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. This is really a fruitful discussion. Right now, the global supply chains are showing their vulnerabilities. The system isn't really working well. I live in California in the US like you, and the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach have, I saw news from last month, 97 ships sitting idle that can't pull the port. Now, I wonder if, global labor unions and activists and advocates can use this as a leverage to say the system is breaking down. The fast fashion, just-in-time system isn't really delivering. Is there any leverage from the inefficiencies? And then here in the US, actually, maybe we're beginning a mini strike wave between the food processing workers at Kellogg's and Hollywood and retail, and continue agitation at Amazon in the distribution sector. Do you see any leverage with the agitation towards, the agreements you're talking about more globally? Can the inefficiencies be used by labor advocates to push for these agreements?
Yeah, wow, fantastic, Gifford. Thank you for that. It's a great point. To be honest, my mind was more sort of, other directions this could head, and how companies will respond, which I'll explain in a second. But, one of the things we've learned by these global supply chains, and it goes back to, discussions way back in the day of just-in-time production, which is connected to, just-in-time production is like Toyota and these different sort of models of production. You didn't have huge inventory, you did just-in-time production. And there was this sense that weakened labor, there was more pressure on labor. And then there was this response in the labor studies literature. And globally, folks like Beverly Silver began writing about it, that that created a vulnerability for capital, right? Because if you could strike at a time with that when there's not a pileup of inventory and there's just in time, that gave you leverage. And we see it in sectors where workers were considered very vulnerable. Agriculture, right? If I strike at making T-shirts in a factory, well, the T-shirts can sit there forever. If I strike where you're producing grapes, there's a famous article, well-known article in Chile, where the women were, they were horribly treated, bad wages, sexual harassment, and the grapes are sitting out. It's 47 degrees Celsius, and those things are going to turn to grape juice in another hour if they don't pack them onto the refrigerated cars. And the women struck, and they got their demands met. So this question of supply chains, just in time, fast fashion, getting to where it needs to be, gives workers leverage. I did some research in Vietnam on this topic in the garment sector, and this wave of wildcat strikes, which was profoundly effective. It wasn't just that there were so many strikes going on in Vietnam, there still are at times. 95% of the strikes that I documented, they met at least one of their demands. And what were they doing? They were striking right at a time, and they could tell, like, it wasn't like you didn't have to be a rocket scientist. You're in the factory, you're doing 8-hour shifts. They said, you know what, okay, let's do 9-10-hour shifts. You know what, oh my goodness, every Friday, everybody, you're working 16 hours or until we get this thing off, because we're at a deadline. If this ship's late, they're going to hit us with a 10% fine on the value of the order because we missed our shipment date. And the workers realized, this is a really good day to go on strike, right? So they were striking right when management was telling them the stuff had to be shipped. So all this is really, there is a point of leverage there. And I'll say this, interestingly, when you think of industrial relations, things, because people say, they didn't have the formal unions, this is all wildcat. It's precisely because they didn't have formal unions and they were doing wildcat strikes, you could leverage in that way, because the formal industrial relations system, what happens, we all know, with strikes. Well, did the bargaining agreement expire? Was there a 30-day cooling off period? Did you set up the vote? Did the majority vote to go on strike? Did the Ministry of Labor review it? At that point, that order shipped, 10 more orders shipped, and everything is all over. And now it's the off season, right? So the wildcat strike action is what allowed them the flexibility to strike precisely at the right moment to inflict the most harm on the company. And they saw there were strikes that profoundly important strikes that were solved in 2 hours, right? I mean, so this is a key question. The question then is always, how do you articulate the demands and the targets in such a complex global supply chain system with these port congestions and so on? The flip side, I just feels important to mention it. When I'm reading the supply chain literature on all this, the newsletters and things, not surprising where they're going with all of this is, oh my goodness, now is the time to really do nearshoring. The U.S. side, we got to stop being so dependent on Asia and bring stuff back to Mexico. And they want it right on the border with Mexico. Denim, for example, is going up and up. And in the European Union, they're talking about Turkey, they're talking about Tunisia, they're talking about Egypt. We got to get this stuff out of Asia. We got to get it close. You're producing in Mexico on the border. You're not dealing with shipping, you're dealing with trucking. So that's the other piece of the story there. And the add to it, the question of automation too. So I'm reading this stuff and I think of, I follow Bangladesh so closely, and I say, okay, they pushed this country for years and years and years to get all into garments, do garments, build ports for garments, build the roads for garments, train the workers for garments, do everything, garments. IMF, World Bank, everybody is telling them to go all in on garments. And then they come and say, you know what, we're going to do nearshoring now and start getting into automation, and nothing in place to replace those jobs that they pushed them for decades to, 84% of exports are garments. And now to say to them, yeah, we don't really want to do it. I think it's not going to be as easy to, pull out of Asia as some of them are suggesting because of the scale that Asia has and the efficiency. But that's the other piece of it. That's where the business discussion is going right now, nearshoring and automation to avoid future supply chain congestion.
Thank you very much, Mark and Gifford, for the great question. We actually had planned for a second question, which was more related actually to the background reading, the excellent background reading that we had from Mark for this video lecture, where you actually argue about the importance of these 3 effective trajectories that you call for decent work in garment value chains, which is basically the global binding agreements that you just explained, but also encompassing collective bargaining agreements and social protection and labor reforms. And you really look at the example of Bangladesh to show that even in a situation of market despotism and fragmented labor movement, there was created some space to actually push somehow for these trajectories. But then the question is, I come from Albania, I'm heavily dependent in the garment sector, and I'm really interested to understand better to what extent that space that was created in Bangladesh was somehow, influenced by the tragic events that happened in Bangladesh, but also by the fact that Bangladesh is such a big supplier of garments. So what are the chances for other countries, to kind of first, luckily, they don't get through these tragic events, and they are not such big suppliers of garments, but they are dependent on that. Our population is just 2.5 million, so a bit of a completely different context there. But how do you see the emergence of these trajectories in other contexts? How possible is that?
Right, great question. This is the bigger project. So this example of the global binding agreement is one of 3 trajectories you mentioned, is touched on in that piece. And if folks are interested in the longer piece that outlines all 3, let me know. I could share that through Adlira. So just to emphasize that point, part of what I'm arguing is this is a very complex set of cases, and it's not one size fits all. Some of the business schools, they love to have best practices. Sometimes that drives me nuts. It's like we as labor activists and scholars, and we have to understand the context of each country to figure out what's going on here. And I would almost say, what's the choke point? What's the bottleneck that's holding back the most? What's the biggest issue? And if I looked at a country like Vietnam, I was saying it's the state. The state, as far as its Communist Party, the control over the unions, the inability to form independent unions. There's something if I say collective bargaining is the answer, but what if a country doesn't have independent unions that are doing collective bargaining, right? You've got these unions that are socialized into harmonious labor relations, which means you don't strike and put hard demands on employers. So there's an issue there that has to first be resolved in Vietnam, in a sense, that you have this state reform. In the case of Central America, I was looking at really violent repression. 2 of the most violent countries in the world, El Salvador, Honduras, not a civil war, and a violence, promoted by employers, and there needed to be something there to address it. So I did an earlier piece, I called it something like 3 models of labor control, 3 patterns of worker resistance. And I got into these, whether it was wildcat strikes, whether it was transnational accords, whether it was bargaining and mobilization. So that's the first thing. So I don't know the case of Albania, but it is a call to say what's, what are the choke points, and what is it the state, is it the is it the labor market, is it the repressive employers, and model and not sort of just take the example from elsewhere and put it there. So that's one. The other is this. I think in social movement literature this comes up too. Sometimes the first example is the hardest, and then you can expand from there. And I'm looking at this in Honduras. It was a really, really difficult agreement with Fruit of the Loom. I mean, they were really hard about, fighting the union and everything else, but they broke through. It's an incredible campaign. I mean, they were, picketing outside Warren Buffett's house when they realized he was the main financial investor, owner of Fruit of the Loom. I mean, it was like going after the investors, going after the companies, going after universities. They did everything. But after that happened, it was like the dam broke forward, and then Gildan ends up pressurized to signing something. Hanes Brands ends up signing, and it's like boom, boom. It's like 50% of factories now are covered by something in Honduras. So the first example was the most difficult. So that's one. So sometimes, once you get the ball rolling. The other is, we constantly think of this question of scale. How do we go from these small isolated examples? I know a friend in El Salvador used to refer to us as the bonsai left. It was pretty, but it was small and it wasn't growing. It was kind of, you had these isolated things. So how do we turn this into a much more robust forest? And in an interesting way. And you think about, I think back to some of the even. Forgive me reciting Marx, but going into Marx's original ideas about organizing, certainly it was part of Marx saying capital had organized labor. Now labor needs to turn the tide. In the sense, what he was saying, capital was going from smaller and small, these small workshops and apprenticeships and different programs into larger and larger scale factories. So capital was connecting us as workers, and then you had the transition. So there, multinational enterprises are presenting us with a framework that gets us everywhere. So if you can pressurize at H&M and you get them to the table and they commit to a binding agreement in Bangladesh, there should be another step where you say, okay, H&M, you agreed to this principles, you agreed to decency at work and safe buildings and this and this and this. You should now, that agreement should go for all your suppliers wherever they are, whether it's Bangladesh, whether it's Honduras, whether it's Albania, right? So you, through the pre-existing structures of multinational corporations, you expand without having to reinvent the wheel and have the same structure, or, God forbid, have to wait for a Rana Plaza in Albania in order to move the process forward. And I think that's part of the idea and the strategy that labor is pursuing.
Thank you, Mark. And it's open for questions. We've got a couple of minutes, so if anybody has any burning question, please do.
I could pop up this last slide. This one I was working on, if you want, for this thing.
Mark, maybe this is a bit different, but I want to know your opinion about certification bodies. We have the example here in Indonesia, the palm oil sector. We have the table for sustainable palm oil. They started to include the labor clause after the trade unions sent a complaint against the biggest buyer. In the result that LSPO reviewed their principle and criteria and included the manpower clause. So the thing is, now companies are trying only to how to say, to point at the salient risk, at the highest risk, and not on the general manpower issues. And trade unions are somehow also put under pressure, because when they go with their cases and and the company said, well, we have already addressed this issue, but on a general way, not per cases. And now we have this global binding agreements. We have also the due diligence law in each of the countries of the buyers. So is the certification scheme still an efficient instrument for trade unions?
Yeah, I have tremendous concerns about, the efficiency. To be honest, we're all concerned about obviously the well-being of workers. So some days I get up and I feel, okay, even if these programs are not for me, if I don't see them empowering, if maybe only 10% of what they're doing is helping workers out somewhere, somebody got up and had somewhat better treatment, then maybe, who might I shoot down and just rip them out so there's nothing. But the more I look at them, the more closely I get, the more concerned I get. So, maybe some of it's sector specific, maybe it's country specific, but the last big research project I did before COVID, I was in Guatemala and I looked at certification as part of the project. I'll put it in, let me do that now, put that in the chat. I looked at it in the banana sector. It was Rainforest Alliance and there were others. I was skeptical of it. I came away horrified by what I saw. I mean, it was a sham through and through. And what I mean by that, and I'm saying, I don't say that lightly, they gave very far advanced notice to the company when they were going to come. And occasionally they had what they called unannounced visits. And I talked to them and I pushed them on this. It turns out unannounced visits, they give you 2 days notice. And the other ones you had like 2 months notice. So it wasn't unannounced. They were giving, and we asked workers in the survey we did, and you'll see it in this finding, did management tell you what to say? And it was overwhelming. The management just literally sits them all down, and it's not nice, pretty, hey, really great if you could help us out. It was vulgar language. I put some of the quotes in, yelling at workers. You tell them we treat you well, or we're going to fire your ass so quickly you'll know what hit you. I mean, there's that kind of quotes in there. So, and I talked to these certifiers, like, we didn't detect any of the problems you found. And I was like, okay, where did you interview the workers while on the factory? Was there unannounced? No, we gave them 2 days notice. It's like, so you're interviewing the workers, management sees you drive up into the farm, they see you get out of the truck, you go into the cafeteria, wherever you go. All those workers were terrified. And the abuses were through the roof. 64% of women reported sexual harassment on the job on these banana plantations. He doesn't report. 98% of those were reviewed by certification programs that had sexual harassment in their protocols. It's like, how the heck do they miss it, right? Not a single union on the southern coast of, and that's in their protocols. I mean, it was, to me, I was concerned about it. I came away with, this is a sham. These workers are being horrifically treated, and these companies are and they're in the factories and they're putting the seals on it. The last step before the bananas go in the box, you got to put the frog or the toad or whatever the heck is on it to show that this was ethically made, in a sham process through and through. And they're hauling in more money than you can imagine to, the charges they make for these certification programs. So that, again, I'm not systematically studying this. I didn't palm oil, a different Asia. I've just
very
looked at
clear, Mark.
Yeah, deep dive in bananas in Guatemala. That's what I found, and it's documented in that report.
Yeah, thanks, Mark.
Well, thanks very much, Mark, for the excellent discussion, really, and for the great questions from everyone. Sorry,
really
Philip,
question.
did you want to say something? I see you waving, or he's saying goodbye. Sorry, I missed him. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. And it was really great discussion. And tomorrow we are going to meet for the last workshop for this course. So we really hope to see many of you in that conversation.